My name is Amy Wildermuth, and I am the Dean of Pitt Law. I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone on this very special evening with a very special guest and dear friend of the law school. We are so pleased to have Janet Dewart Bell here with us today. You are in for a fantastic treat. When we have someone as amazing as Janet joining us, it is a good idea to find someone extra special to welcome her. Luckily, we have the right person for this job. He is also someone familiar to most of you here. Former Dean Chip Carter served for 6 years as Pitt Law's dean. Among the many accomplishments during his leadership, Pitt Law's faculty retained its national prominence, both in scholarly impact and in education. Numerous key new programs and initiatives were begun, and he even managed to live through the renovation of this floor and the 2 floors above us. We are deeply grateful to Dean Carter for all he has done for Pitt Law. I also want to add my personal thanks for his warmth, his wise and well-considered advice, his humor, and his incredible generosity in continuing to support and help me in this new role. What I cannot believe, though, is how he could have done this job for so long without any gray hair to show for it. Let me tell you, when I have to stand next to him, it does not do me any favors. Thank you again for being here with us tonight. Please join me now in welcoming Chip, who will introduce our friend.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. Amy, thank you for your kind words. I will point out, however, that I am keeping the Just for Men beard dye club, which is why you don't see the gray, but trust me, it is there. On a more serious note, I want to thank Amy and Lauren Waiter, as well as all of our staff, for asking me to deliver this introduction. I was saying earlier to the Bell family, there aren't many things for which I would come off of sabbatical and into work voluntarily, but this one is really a privilege and a pleasure to be asked to introduce my dear friend, and in many ways a role model, Dr. Janet Dewart Bell. I want to just do 2 things. I want to read Janet's formal bio, and then I just want to share a couple of brief words, if I may, about Janet and indeed the Bell family and the impact that they've had, not just on the school, but on me personally. So, Dr. Janet Dewart Bell is a social justice activist with a doctorate in leadership and change from Antioch University. She's the widow of University of Pittsburgh School of Law alum Derrick Bell, class of 1957. And in honor of Derrick and his legacy, she helped to fund our Derrick Bell Fund for Excellence, which provides funding for scholarships for students with financial need, as well as funding for students to work as research assistants on projects involving constitutional law and civil rights issues. In recognition of the Bell family's generosity and of Derrick's impact, we established the Derrick Bell Constitutional Law Commons in our library, which is a wonderful contemplative space. And I would encourage you all to take the opportunity to see it. It really reflects Derrick's legacy quite well. Dr. Bell also founded the Derrick Bell Lecture on Race and American Society series at NYU Law School. And when she's not pursuing her scholarly endeavors, she's an award-winning television and radio producer in New York City. In her book, Lighting the Fires of Freedom, Janet shines a light on women's all too often overlooked contributions toward the civil rights movement. Through a series of wide-ranging conversations with 9 women, several of whom are now in their 90s, I believe, she's uncovered their stories of activism and what inspired and fueled them as they moved the civil rights movement forward. Her book, Lighting the Fires of Freedom, offers deeply personal accounts of these women's extraordinary struggles for justice that resulted in profound social change, stories that are still vital and relevant today. I want to take a moment, having shared with you a very short synopsis of Janet's work, just a couple of personal reflections. And Janet, you've heard me say some of this in other settings, but I'd like to share it with this group because I think it's important. I first got to know Janet personally when I became the Dean of Pitt Law through our relationship with the Bell family and honoring Derrick's legacy, as I described a while ago. She was also kind enough to invite me to be a lecturer at NYU's Bell Lecture series, which was one of the real honors of my professional career. But what I want to tell you about is actually a little bit about Janet herself and about the Bell family. Janet's intellect is well known and is obviously reflected in her scholarly work. What you might not know simply from the book is about her wit, her grace, her humor, her warmth, her willingness to support students in every way, in any way possible at all times, and indeed her willingness to support anyone who she believes is committed to the cause of justice. And so, Janet, I wanted to let you know, as much as I admire the book and your work, I admire you as a person. I thank you for the support that you've given not only the law school, but have given to me. I also want to thank the entire Bell family for something that a few of you know, but not all of you would know, and I'll be brief. I would not be where I am were it not for Derrick Bell. I've told some of you in various settings that what actually interested me in law school was faces at the bottom of the well. I was a bit adrift when I was leaving college and was at home figuring out what exactly I wanted to do with my life. And I pulled that book off of my sister's bookshelf and it changed my life. It illustrated ways in grappling with the legacy of race and racism and inequality and criminal justice that had been running around in my head, but I had no voice to give to them. It was a profound moment, and it was made all the more profound when I turned the book over and saw this picture of this beautiful, dignified, dark-skinned black man. It gave me an opportunity to have something to aspire to that I don't think I would have seen were it not for Derrick. And so I want to thank the entire family because I know that Derrick's work was not his own endeavor. It was a family project. It was made possible by your support of him. And Janet, I want you to know that somewhere there is some person who will be reading this book and will have the same experience that I had with faces at the bottom of the well. There will be someone who is inspired, who is engaged, who you've given a voice and a language to see who they can become. So I want to thank you for continuing the legacy that made so much possible for me. With that, I will turn the podium to my dear friend, Janet Dewart Bell.
To say that I am overwhelmed by that wonderful introduction is an understatement. Thank you so much. Chip Carter was the 18th lecturer of the Bell series on race and American society at NYU. It's now in his 23rd year, and he set a really high standard for those following him. And the people who preceded him were not shabby. They included Charles Ogletree, Annette Gordon-Reed, a whole list, Richard Delgado, a whole list of wonderful people. And I want to say how warmly I've been welcomed today by your new dean, Dean Amy Wildermuth. And I thank you so much for your kindness and generosity today. As I've gotten older, I've gotten a little bit looser with my presentations. They're not so formal, so you're going to have to join in with me today. And also, they tell me this is a new technology system, so we're inaugurating it today. So you see me looking at Kim all the time, so I can get some guidance. Oh, Lord, I done. Oh, Lord, I done. I said, oh, Lord, I done what you told me to do. Well, you told me to pray. I done, well, you told me to pray. Come on, sing. I done, well, you told me to pray. I done what you told me to do. And you told me to sing. Well, you told me to sing. Well, you told me to sing. I done what you told me to do. I said, oh, Lord, I done. I said, oh, Lord, I done. I said, oh, Lord, I done what you told me to do. During the civil rights movement, African African Americans led the fight to free this country from the vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow. African American women played significant roles at all levels of the civil rights movement, yet too often they remain invisible to the larger public. While some African American women led causes and organizations, such as Dorothy Height, the president of Delta Sigma Theta sorority and the National Council of Negro Women, others did not have titles or official roles. They did not stand on ceremony. They simply did the work that needed to be done without expectation of personal gain. Often unnamed or underappreciated, African American women helped to construct the cultural architecture for change. Women, such as the crusading anti-lynching journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett and Rosa Parks, were also anti-rape activists. They tried to protect Black women from the white Southern tradition of droit de seigneur, literally, the right of the Lord. In the antebellum and Jim Crow South, that meant Black women's lives and bodies did not matter. White men abused and raped Black women at will and without punishment. African American leaders and activists addressed the most important and volatile issues of the times: segregation, lynching, education, economic justice. People who lived and worked in the South, in the heat of the civil rights cauldron, were the heart and soul of the movement. Their heroic actions, often putting themselves and their families in harm's way, were without equal. As servant leaders, African American women were rooted in their desire first to serve communities rather than gaining power for themselves. They were not servile. Now, I cannot come to Pitt without sharing this with you. This is a portrait done in fabric by this wonderful artist named Connie Kaganapam Heller. And I have the original, I'm not giving that away. But when I spoke at a little school up north, I think it's in Cambridge, a couple weeks ago, Connie presented a print of this to the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute at the Harvard Law School. And in it, she talks about having done this, and I think as an artist, and culture is so important to the African American struggle, she talks, I'm going to read a little bit from her words about Derrick Bell, where she says, I remind myself, focus on light and shadow, lines of laughter and of loss. Every experience collapsed into one being, past but still present, unfinished but refined, ordered but not, complex but clear, a whole in many shades of blue. I remind myself to focus on justice. A face emerges from the unrecognizable, and the work of a lifetime continues on for all of us who aspire to practice, to live justice. I hear stories, this is Connie's writing, about Derrick Bell, his memory determined to continue the struggle, his favorite sayings, his work, the principles by which he led his life. Professor Bell stood up, literally stood up and left the security of Harvard Law to protest injustice. This is the heart of this collage that Connie has done. And I shouldn't be so selfish, but one day if you see the original, which is done totally in thread, it's just absolutely fabulous. Derrick's mom played such an important part in who he became. And so I want to acknowledge her as well. And he writes about her all the time, and you notice I still sometimes use present tense. He wrote about her all the time, and he always credited her with being his really first role model for injustice. I remember he was telling the story about living on Milwaukee Street, and the back steps were not fixed on their house, and they weren't on your neighbor's house. This was the Hill District. And so his mother not only got the landlord to fix their steps, she had the landlord fix the steps of everybody else in the block. And so that's the kind of background that Derrick came up and that helped shape his life. And Chip mentioned that he's a graduate of this law school in 1957. In the same class as Richard Thornburg. They were both on law review together. My book is dedicated to the memory of, guess who, Derrick Bell. And I'm going to read it. Beloved husband, courageous prophet, impassioned feminist, steadfast and gentle warrior for racial and social justice. And to my mother, Willie Mae Neal. Beloved mother, Wonder Woman, freedom torch bearer, true believer in the promise of America. May their lives continue to inspire and guide us. This is the inscription from my book. Now, I mentioned my mother, Willie Mae Neal. My mother, Willie Mae Neal, was born in rural Arkansas, and she was one of 3 daughters. She was the youngest daughter. She could not go to school beyond the 8th grade because the nearest school for black children was 100 miles away in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so she had to stay at home and help her parents with their farm, their 35 acres. They were also tenant farmers. They had 35 acres. They did not have 40 acres and a mule. Isn't she cute? That's my grandmother. Less than 5 feet, less than 100 pounds, could drag a 100-pound sack of cotton through 120-degree heat. One day, as was the case, insurance men, they were all white males, would come on Friday afternoon to collect the premium. And one insurance man apparently did not get the word, you do not mess with Sophronia McKnight's daughters. So he fondled one of her daughters in front of her. My grandmother, less than 5 feet, less than 100 pounds, remember they live in the country, calmly walks over to the gun rack, picks up a gun, and aims it so she misses young man's ear by just about this much. Well, he wasn't totally ridiculous, he left. My grandparents then sent their daughters away because they thought surely they would be lynched. But they refused to lay low to anybody, and they stood their ground. A week went by, nothing happened. Another week went by, nothing happened. Eventually, another young white insurance man came on a Friday to collect the premium, looked at my grandmother and said, Aunt Sophronia, as if nothing had ever happened. My grandmother lived to be almost 80 years old. That's the kind of legacy I come from. And that's something I try to live up to every day. This is my encounter with the Klan about 1967. I did my little bit in the Civil Rights Movement. If you read it, it says, Save America. Are we hearing that again? Make America Great Again? Excuse me. Join United Klans. Come hear the truth. Good preaching, country music, white public only. There was not a Muslim in sight. I was staying with a family in Southern Virginia where the Klan would come through with their hoods and their torches and what have you. And I was young and really foolish, and I decided to go to the rally along with some other young, really foolish people. And when the Klan discovered that there were people there not of their kind, we decided perhaps it was time for us to leave. I grabbed this poster off the telephone pole, and I've kept it all these many years. I want to talk a little bit about some of the women who are not in my book, and then go to the 9 oral histories of the women who are in the book. So we can do call and response, it's fine with me. Ella Baker worked for the major civil rights organizations, but she's better known for having worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where they call her Fundi, leader, someone who leads from one generation to another. Fannie Lou Hamer, I'm sick and tired of. All right, you go to the head of the class. She was so powerful, like my grandmother. She was about yay big, had powerful singing voice. And her statement at the Democratic National Convention was so powerful that LBJ had to have a fake news conference in the Rose Garden just to take attention away from her. And I thought, whoo, this is one powerful lady. I want to talk a second about the Montgomery Bus Boycott, where people walked or took alternate means of transportation for over a year. Now, you know, you can barely get someone to walk a block. And people did that. How did they do that? Because there's some people who had the vision to know that when the time came to have a coordinated protest, you had to plan alternate means of transportation, and they did. One of the people who did that, Joanne Johnson, who was a teacher at the local black college. There's Joanne Johnson. She was also involved with the Women's Political Council. Do you know who Claudette Colvin was? This is a real test. This is deep down in the civil rights history. And the reason I wanted to show some of these people, because I wanted to illustrate my research, which has seemed forever as I got my doctorate and then wrote this book, is to show that leadership can come from any place. You can lead from the middle of the pack. You do not have to have a title to lead. So I'm focusing on leadership, not leaders per se. Claudette Colvin was a teenager, and she sat down on a bus a few months before Mrs. Parks did. But she was not deemed the proper symbol for the movement. I don't blame them for that. Everyone knew that Mrs. Parks was, beyond reproach. She was secretary of the local NAACP. She had been trained in nonviolence at the Highlander Folk Center. She had a history of everybody liking her. I tracked down Claudette Colvin just a few months ago, and I begged her for an interview. She's not yet granted me that right, but I hope to be able to do that. She's 79 years old now, I think, and she lives in the Bronx, New York. But she was a teenager, and she did the same thing. She was considered a bit defiant at the time. She was maybe 15 or so. Georgia Gilmore, a cook. She and other workers, household workers, organized events and activities to raise funds to support the boycott. She started the club from nowhere to try to give a little anonymity to their activities. Of course, everybody knew it was. People lost their jobs, and even worse. But that's Georgia Gilmore representing everyday people who rose to the occasion and continue to rise to the occasion. Rosa Parks, we mentioned before. You see at that one picture, the Highlander Library, that shows to show her she was there. And in Tennessee, remember these times that interracial gatherings by themselves were against the law. And, but at any rate, there are people like Rosa Parks and others who persisted. This is Rosa Parks at a later age. Daisy Bates and the Little Rock Nine. Daisy Bates was head of the NAACP in Little Rock in terms of the integration of the Central High School in Little Rock. And these young people, the same ages as those wonderful, brave children at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School in Parkland, Florida, integrated a school where people were yelling at them, calling them names that, they used to say in my neighborhood, calling them out their names, And one young girl, Elizabeth Eckford, did not have a phone, so she missed the notice that they had changed the entrance to go into the school. They were all going to go in together with some sort of protection. And there's a picture that you will see of her in various reports, where this young girl walking into a school by herself. People, adults, yelling at her, saying all kinds of vile things, a traumatic experience that stood with her for the rest of her life. I just want to set the stage for what people did and what they went through. Emmett Till's mother, who showed adaptive leadership. I'll use one of my academic terms. By deciding to have an open casket so that the world could see what happened to her son. Imagine, you send your child from Chicago to stay with his relatives in Mississippi, have a peaceful summer, what have you. He goes to a store and he either says or does not say, the woman later said she made this up, we could have told you that, but at that time they said he either whistled or said bye baby or said something like that. Later on there's a knock at the door of his relative's home. Klan takes this child out, mutilates him, throws his body in the river. When they dredged the river for his body, they found the river of other men, women, and children. Similarly, when they dredged the river for the bodies of James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman in 1964, they found the same thing. This is Mrs. Bradley, who, well, her name changed a little bit, so I had all the names there. Sometimes you'll see Mrs. Bradley, but later Mrs. Mobley, but Emmett Till's mother. I'll spare you the open casket. What she said at the time was that she could love the children of those people who killed her son as she could her own child. Now, when I wrote this for The Nation magazine earlier this year, they asked me to do an article. They fact-checked it. They said that could not be so. It stayed in the article. So I'm about the love revolution. Now, a lot of y'all are lawyers and law professors, so we have to talk about Constance Baker Motley, who was the first woman hired by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Constance Baker Motley was incredible. She was one of the three major mentors of Derrick Bell, along with Thurgood Marshall and Robert L. Carter. They used to call her that Motley woman, and when she would do a trial, people would come from miles around to see this woman, this black woman, in front of, you know, they're all white judges, the juries, all that kind of stuff, argue her case. And she was stellar at all times. Someone asked her, I won't identify those two people she's with, I think you know. She was asked one time how she prepared for trial. And she said she went to Lord & Taylor and bought another suit. A little cheeky, but you get the point. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on the 9 women in my book. Leah Chase, Dookie Chase Restaurant, New Orleans, let the good times roll. Aha! Laissez les bon temps rouler, right? Reason she's in the book, that the Chase family would host meetings of civil rights workers totally against the law. Their business could have been shut down at any moment, but because the Chase family was so well regarded, it was not. Leah Chase, when I interviewed her, was 90 years old. I interviewed her in the restaurant, which had been rebuilt after Hurricane Katrina. She was 85 when the waters came. She stayed in a FEMA trailer while they rebuilt her restaurant. When the waters came, her son had the presence of mind to save the art which she had amassed on the wall. At one time, she had one of the largest collections of African-American art, not only in New Orleans, but in the country. That art is on the walls today. Mrs. Chase has so many expressions, as do all the other women. You know, I pleaded with them because part of my process was when I finished the interviews and wrote them up, used my editorial judgment, I sent to each of the women the introduction to the book, the introduction to their chapter and their chapter. I did not share the other chapters with them. And several people said, oh, you know, I don't sound as intelligent as I want to. I said, oh, you sound perfectly intelligent. And so I pleaded with them to keep their colloquialisms, you know, their slang and what have you. So Mrs. Chase got loose. She said, you bam it down. You know, I don't have to explain that, right? You know what she's saying. She talks about how your work is what you do for other people. She also mentions the people she's most admired. And they would not surprise you, 3 women. Myrlie Evers, who is the last interview in my book, Coretta Scott King, and Betty Shabazz. A couple things that Mrs. Chase said. She said, you know, part of our problem as older people is we did not listen to the young people. We were afraid. They were doing things we had not done before. And so she said that we should have listened more to what they said. And she talks about it takes prayer and it takes getting things done. She's more Catholic than the Pope, by the way. When I was interviewing her, she was getting a commendation from Pope Benedict, and it had to be really quick because he was leaving. And I had a videographer, and her daughter, who is really acts as her agent, asked if we would video this for posterity, and we did do that and gave that to Mrs. Chase. I was honored to be able to do that. Mrs. Chase, among other things, she's still cooking in the kitchen, by the way. She's like 95, and she doesn't cook every day, but she still cooks. She is the inspiration for Princess Tiana and Princess and the Frog. I said, who knew we'd have a Duchess? This is a more recent photo of Mrs. Chase. Dr. June Jackson Christmas was born in 1924. She grew up in Massachusetts. She never really worked in the South, and that's part of, if there's any controversy to my book, it's that I say that the civil rights movement was broad spread. Different people, different areas, people contributed as they want to. And I try to give that message today, particularly to young people. You don't have to be in one area. You can be where you are and contribute. One thing that she did, by the way, she graduated from Vassar in 1944. And she graduated from Boston University School of Medicine a few years after that. She's a pioneer in psychiatry. When she was a student at Vassar, she fought for Japanese American students who were interned. And she was the only black student, so a group of them went to the president of the university and said, I want to have scholarships for Japanese American girls to come to school. And they said, you can't do that, that's racist. Now, remember, there are like 2 blacks in the class and they're telling her that what she's saying is racist. So she went back to the dormitory with the students, and they came up with a plan. So they went back, they said, what if we have scholarships for people who are displaced by these policies? And so the president said, oh, okay, we can do that, and they did. So she was responsible for Japanese American students who were displaced going to Vassar. This picture here was taken in 1970. She happened to be at a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, and during that time, several students were killed at Jackson State College in Mississippi, and Dr. Christmas addressed the group about the trauma and what was going on there. Oh, by the way, later she became a mental health commissioner in New York City under 3 mayors. But her contribution to the civil rights movement was she and her husband Walter hosted groups from the South to stay with them in their big townhouse. She raised money. She gave counseling. They said, Dr. Christmas, people weren't talking about post-traumatic stress then, but they were saying, Dr. Christmas, we don't have anyone to talk to. And we're being beaten. We're subjected to danger, what have you. So she and her husband took people in. Extraordinary woman. This is Dr. Christmas about 93, 94. Don't hate her. She looks like that now, today. And she's a wonderful, wonderful person and role model. Aileen Hernandez is the only one of the 9 women I interviewed who died before the book was published. She died last year in 2017. Aileen Hernandez was a student activist at Howard University. People sometimes forget that Howard University is in the South. and was subject to all of that segregation that the rest of the South was. Maybe not as violent at the time, but it was. And this was during the time of war when she started as a student, and so she also mentions that as a young woman at Howard University, they had opportunities because the men were away that they might not have had otherwise. But one of the opportunities they had were to become really activists and leaders, and they assumed those roles. So Aileen Hernandez talks about when she left New York, where she was living. She's of Jamaican parents. And she was taking the train to Washington, D.C., and all those wonderful, elegant sleeping car porters, I thought they were the most elegant men in the world, took care of her and her family, as they did with other blacks who rode the train, who were not allowed to be in the big car, stuff like that. They helped feed them. They also told them when they got to D.C., look for the black taxi. So Ms. Hernandez and her father go out and they looking for the taxi colored black. And after they approached several taxis and were refused service, they finally realized what the black taxi really was. Aileen Hernandez she represents to me intersectionality because she became an activist in the women's rights movement, labor, and she was also appointed she was the first woman and first person of color appointed to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, among other things. She became the first and only, sadly, African-American president of the National Organization for Women. She left that organization when, after her term ended, they fielded an all-white slate. She was outraged that would happen. She became more involved in the labor union, and so the international ILGW, International Lady Garment Workers Union, and she moved to California at some point, but she remained active her whole life until shortly before she died. She mentioned, I can't let this moment go by, she mentions Maida Springer as an inspiration, the mother of Mr. Eric Springer right there. Maida Springer was not necessarily considered in the civil rights movement. What she did, and so I have to say, when I say this in front of people who actually know the facts, I want to make sure that I'm fact-checked properly, that she was very involved in the labor movement. This is Maida Springer, the AFL-CIO, and I say that she convinced them to work in Africa, where she took you as a child, right? And she predated the freedom movements in Africa. And those freedom movements in Africa predated, in some ways, some of the civil rights activities in this country. So she's a very important figure. There are a couple books written about her, and you would do well to read them. Judy Richardson represents the young people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to me. This is a lunch counter protest. Judy's also represents people who are so modest. When I asked her if I could interview her, she said, I haven't done anything. Why do you want to talk to me? And I said, well, I beg to differ with you. Besides, it's my book. And so at any rate, she agreed. But among the many things that Judy did, she helped to manage, she worked in the South. She says her experience in the movement was really with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. She worked in the South, and she helped manage the wide area telephone system. Okay, young people, that was pre-internet. And people had to call in every couple of hours so that you would know where they were and whether or not they were alive. This is a very serious task, and she would call and report whatever the status was to the FBI when we had an FBI. She later became the series associate producer of Eyes on the Prize, among many things that Judy has done. She says, this is a nice quote that she said. She says, we always understood it's about white supremacy. She said, we also understood respect, the intelligence of regular black folk. And she talks about the movement was never just about black people. And if you read, there was that Black Power thing, we all got that. But if you read really about the civil rights movement, we were talking about uplifting everybody, rights of everybody. I wanted to go back to a quote that I forgot to say about Leah Chase before I forget, because it's a great quote. She said, after she got into it, we talked for several hours, she refused to take a break. The videographer and I were going like this, said, Mrs. Chase, wouldn't you like to take a break? She said no, and she kept going. And at one point she just looked, and she said, now I was in my 60s at the time, I'm 72 now. She said, it's good that young people like you are writing these stories because people need to know. The other thing that she said, more importantly, she said, who knew you could change the world over a bowl of gumbo? She said, that's what I did. That's my contribution. Chilling, exciting. This is Judy Richardson a few years ago at a Martin Luther King Day celebration in Boston. Obviously, I'm skipping right through these, but all these pictures are in the book of the 9 women, not the previous ones. Diane Nash, any of you saw the movie Selma? In the otherwise fine movie, when they showed Diane Nash, they showed her in the background as the guys were plotting strategy. You know they had to hold me down in the theater. Because I'm thinking, no, this woman is a strategist. How can you do that? She was a student at Fisk University. She took over the Freedom Ride after the Corps Workers, the Congress on Racial Equality bus was attacked. The bus was bombed. People got out the back window of this bus. They were beaten there and elsewhere. And she said, Diane Nash passionately believed then and believes to this day in nonviolence. She says, if we allowed violence to stop us, we would never progress. And it would create more violence, because people thought, hey, that's all you have to do. We can put the movement down right now. And so she did not succumb to that. She said that nonviolence is the most efficient thing she can think of. She really talks about efficiency and diligence and commitment and dedication to a cause. So that's Diane Nash, who is incredible. Several people, when I was talking about doing the research, said you cannot do the research on this without talking to Diane Nash. And she was my hardest get, and I'm glad she was gone. This is a recent picture of Diane Nash, 2016. Kathleen Cleaver, the real Black Panther. Kathleen Cleaver was really raised in the protected cocoon of Tuskegee, Alabama. Her father was a professor. At first he was a professor in Wiley College in Texas, but he became an international agricultural development specialist. So she lived abroad for much of her formative years. So she says white supremacy didn't have a chance with her because she lived in India and the Philippines, where Black and brown people were in charge. Her mother, by the way, was not shabby. Her mother got a master's degree when she was 16 years old from the University of Michigan. And Kathleen said that her parents thought that she might be doing the same, following in her mother's footsteps. She said, 16, I was still in high school. Now, but what she did, Kathleen always wanted to be, when she was a child, she always wanted to be in the movement. And so she jumped at the opportunity to work for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and later to work for the Black Panthers. Remember, Black Panthers were a community organization. They did breakfast. They related to the community, community related to them. Kathleen Cleaver is one of the smartest people you'll ever meet. Graduated when she and her then husband, Eldridge Cleaver, who were on the FBI's most wanted list, had to skedaddle. They were on the lam from the FBI for a few years. When they came, and their children were born abroad, by the way. And when they came back, she went back to school. I'm fast forwarding a lot of this stuff. And she graduated summa cum laude, undergraduate school from Yale, and then cum laude in law school. I think she was just distracted by something. She probably should have been summa cum laude then. But she's just so smart, and she's the nicest person. People, I was being interviewed by someone, they said, oh, you interviewed Kathleen Cleaver. Oh, that, I said, wait, stop right there. She allowed me to come into her home for a day while her grandchildren were visiting from the Sudan. Now, those of you who are grandparents, or parents of children who have grandparents, you know how precious that kind of time is. And she was just wonderful and as gracious as you could be. Several people said to me, is she still as gorgeous as she once was? The answer is yes. My editor at the publishing house wanted me to take out the reference to looks. She said, you know, I'm tired of people talking about women and their looks and everything. I said, no, you don't understand. The reason I reference her looks, Diane Nash's, because it has context. Also, it's a celebration of black women about black women's beauty. And so we went back and forth. I'd put it in, they'd take it out. I'd put it in, they'd take it out. It's in the book. Gay McDougall integrated Agnes Scott College outside of Atlanta in Decatur, Georgia. She was the first black student that they allowed to enter their school. She's a contemporary of mine. She was the only black student for 2 years. After 2 years, she transferred to Bennington College. She then graduated. Why do people keep going to Yale Law School? At some point she graduated from there, but she was very involved in the anti-apartheid movement in this country. Among other things, she was an organizer of the demonstrations in Washington, D.C. And then she became an overseer of the first free elections in South Africa. And when Madiba, the great Nelson Mandela, voted for the first time, Gay McDougall accompanied him. That's Gay McDougall today. Gloria Richardson did not passionately believe in nonviolence. In contrast to Diane Nash, Gloria Richardson got involved in the civil rights movement to support her teenage daughter and her friends because she thought, well, that's something that a mother should do. And she was so animated, shall we say, that the daughter put her off the line because Gloria Richardson, who still has this little twinkle in her eye, devilish sense of humor, would try to trip white people as they were walking by the picket lines. And her daughter said, Mom, you can't do that, and told her to get out of the line. And so Gloria Richardson, right, she says, it was a total switching thing. And I love her phrases too. Speaking of phrases, some of the language that I kept in, she uses the phrase, not as put down, but she talks about sedity blacks. And my editor said, what's that? And I had to explain it. So there's a footnote about sedity. First they wanted to take it out. And I said, no, people will get it. First of all, you'll get it in context, right? There's a context for it. And secondly, that's what she said. And I think it added color and life to it. So finally, on a couple of these things, like sedity, I just finally wrote I wrote a memo to my publisher, lovely, wonderful publisher, the New Press, and I said, just call them blackisms and just leave them in there. People understand that. So Gloria Richardson, this is a picture of her when the National Guard, she could not believe someone would point a gun in her face. And what's a girl to do? She just swatted it away. And she's like that today in her 90s. She was astounded, was it last year, the year before, when the city of Cambridge, Maryland, who she had protested, shut down businesses, done all that kind of thing. I mean, she's fighting with the national government. She's bringing it all times. When they had a day honoring her for her service. All right. This is Merle Evers. Her husband, Medgar Evers, was essentially assassinated in front of her and their 3 small children. I'm going to essentially end by reading an excerpt from the book, an edited excerpt about Merle Evers. When Medgar Evers was appointed the first NAACP field secretary in the state of Mississippi in 1954, he negotiated a paid position for Merle as the office's secretary. They were basically the office. Their home was firebombed in 1962. In June 1963, Medgar Evers was assassinated in their driveway. Widowed with 3 small children, Merle Evers stayed in their home for a year, where the driveway was an emotionally intense daily reminder of her husband's death. In the summer of 1964, she addressed the NAACP convention at the time when the civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were missing and not yet discovered murdered. She later moved to California. At the age of 31, she went back to college working part-time, she had 3 small kids, and graduated from Pomona College in 1968 with a degree in sociology. She vigilantly pursued justice for the murder of her husband, a 3-decade commitment that ended in a conviction finally in 1994. Now remember, all the black people knew who did it. All the white people knew who did it. But the legal system did not support them until 1994. The Everest Home is now a national monument on a quiet, unassuming residential street. Its location brings into sharp focus the terror that was a part of the everyday lives of African Americans. Mrs. Evers, many people have remembered her from the Obama inauguration. Today she remains beautiful, gracious, grateful, and propelled by an invisible life force, a mixture of compassion, curiosity, and righteous anger. Her candor and openness can shock one expecting to encounter a martyr or saint. She is defiantly a whole person. For African Americans, preserving personhood is itself an accomplishment. Now in her own words. I was very fortunate to be surrounded by people who love me dearly. My grandmother and my aunt told me I could accomplish anything that I set my mind to do, as long as I stayed within the boundaries of what society had set for me. Then Medgar came along, and he said, "You can do whatever you want to do, but keep those boundaries out of the way. You never stop dreaming for something higher and better." Medgar was a veteran of World War II, as was my father. When Medgar returned to Mississippi, he decided to confront the rampant prejudice and racism. I came along, they married at 18, and learned as we moved forward in the work in the Mississippi Delta, and then later in Jackson, Mississippi. Medgar was the first known African American to apply for admission to the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. When he went to visit the state NAACP president to talk about the NAACP supporting him in a suit for admittance, instead, they talked him into taking the position as the first field secretary for the NAACP and opening an office in Jackson. It was a very, very interesting time. It was not only typing, organizing events or celebrations, or even the sad things to acknowledge people who had been hurt, who had been killed. I did research for his speeches. I even wrote some of them. We were behind the cotton curtain, because you cannot get information out to the wire services that you could in any other part of the country. It meant being concise with what you reported and sending that information to the NAACP office in New York City, and you did it, young people, by telegram. I was a welcoming committee to people who came in. Everyone visited our house. always find a place. I think of Thurgood Marshall, Constance Motley, attorney Derrick Bell. What a terrible time I had trying to balance a budget of $25 every 2 weeks feeding and housing people, but it was our home. Many of us bonded. There are a few of us still around. We have been there. It was an exciting but frightening time because you stared at death every day and you walked, and death walked with you. But there was always hope, and there were always people who surrounded you to give you a sense of purpose. You try to prepare, you do a little role playing. I personally would put myself in a position where I had just lost my husband. I knew it was coming. I recall a conversation with Medgar not too long before his assassination. I said to him, I can't live without you. I can't make it without you. And he looked at me and said, you're much stronger than you think you are. You will be okay. You must believe it. Today, when I visit our former home, I can still see the blood. We needed to get away from that place. Our oldest son, Daryl Kenyatta, reached a point where he refused to eat. He would not study, he would not talk. My daughter would go to bed with her dad's picture, holding it every night. The youngest one, Van, who was 3, would go to bed with this little rifle. I knew we could no longer live in that house. A woman who was lonely and afraid, but one who was determined to make it. Everything I did was based on what I thought Medgar would have wanted and the promises that I made to him the night before he was killed. My grandmother said to me, you run as far away from Mississippi as you can get without going into the ocean. California became home, and until this day, it still is. Now, as an academic, try to summarize what the major themes are. And this is my poor summary. But these women, their stories, the stories of other women, represent to me authenticity, courage, and purpose. Deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. her own way to make it happen.
First, I want to thank you as well. I really thought that was a very inspiring presentation, and I'm so happy that you're back. I was wondering about the process by which you selected the 9 women that you selected. I'm a little biased because I was Judge Motley's clerk along with Professor Brake, so we would have loved to see her in the book.
So we'd love to see
Judge Motley. We clerked for Judge Motley. So we were kind of, I was just, I'm sure it was a very difficult decision for you to decide which women sort of you were going to pick and which women you just couldn't fit into the book. And so I was wondering about the process by which you chose the 9 women that you did and why you chose them, and how you ended up making the very, very difficult decisions that you made to sort of stick the women, to include the women that you did and not exclude, but just you couldn't include everybody. And so.
Well, I would have loved to have had Judge Motley too. At the time when I started the research, she was not available. And then of course she died before I got into writing the book per se. So part of it, the process by which I selected people, I wanted people who represented a diversity of leadership roles and activities in the civil rights movement. And so there were a lot, I could have done this with all lawyers. I kept looking, I said, oh my goodness, is that all they did? They went to law school afterwards? But that's not the case. But Game Duell is a lawyer, Kathleen Cleaver is a lawyer. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted Leah Chase. I wanted Gloria Richardson. I wanted those kind of people. I wanted Diane Nash, who did not become a lawyer. She became a tenant organizer. She went back to Chicago, became a tenant organizer. And that's an important distinction I want to make, because as the book was going to press, she called me. Now, she was the hardest get. And she said, if it's not too late, I'd like to change something. And I said, because remember, I'd sent them all their introductions. I said, Ms. Nash, whatever you want to do, I'll do my best. And she said, I know where you got it, because for 50 years, people have been saying that I was a housing organizer. She said, I'm a tenant organizer. And I said, oh, thank goodness. So I was able to change that. And there was another thing. I told her she's very precise, that I was able to change. But the process, there's so many women who I wanted to get, and a couple of whom, Dovey Roundtree recently died. I'm trying to think of another great person I wanted to interview. Actually talked to her, and she recently died. So those are stories, the personal stories, they're in their own words, we're not going to necessarily hear. But thank goodness there's a lot of work on Constance Baker Motley. And I dare say there's not a lot of work on some of the other people.
Hello.
Hello. She's a doctoral student.
Yes. Thank you. So, like the doctoral student I am, I have a question about a definition of a word that you used. I'm reading a lot right now, and a book that I'm currently reading that's in my bag right now is Ethical Ambition by your late husband. And so far, probably my favorite book I've ever read. And there's a chapter in there on courage and risk-taking. And I saw that theme that you drew out, and that's the theme that I'm seeing a lot in the Black feminist work that I've been reading. So I'm curious what your definition of courage is.
Courage, my definition of courage?
Yes.
Is the ability to work through fear and to take positions that are not particularly popular at the time.
Thank you.
And no one's ever asked me that before.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for your talk and for sharing and for your work. I wanted to ask you, I can't wait to read your book. What I have gotten from your talk is this redefinition of power by people who have either been marginalized or used to seeing power come in certain packages and in certain boxes. And I want to know how you feel about that interpretation? That's the first part. And also, just as someone who likes to educate and likes to bring these stories to the youngest audience possible, how do you see this playing out in a K-12 space? How do we introduce these stories to young people, particularly those who are in schools that have been chronically disinvested into and those who've been minoritized?
I'll have to unpack that. On the K-12, that's a longer answer, I think.
Right,
but I
right.
think it's perfectly all right to interpret part of what I'm saying is that the redefinition of power. You know, Alice Walker said something like, we have everything. We have the power. She didn't, I don't think she did not, she may not have necessarily used that word. She said, we mean black people, but we don't have the guns and the money. But she held on to what is the spirit of what we bring. And I think that's something you're getting when you're reading at the Calendish. Now, on K-12, I have to say this. When Essence Magazine reviewed my book, they said, do share it with the youngins, because it's an accessible book. It's intentionally written so that people can understand it. My introductions are really pretty short. What I tried to do was get out of the way and let people talk. And people, I knew that I had faith that what they were saying and how they were going to say it was going to be of great importance for me and hopefully for other people as well. But that's a long question on that. So a couple more and we're done. This is your last chance.
Thank you so much for your work and for the talk and for being here. My question is, if you felt the need, and I'll find this out when I read the book.
I can't hear, I'm sorry.
My question is, I'll find this out when I read the book, which I'm excited to read the book. If you felt the need to address the strategy of moving away from male charismatic figures who really got the credit and got a lot of the energy around the civil rights movement, if you felt the need to address that.
Yes.
Okay. Because obviously the book highlights what vital roles black women played in organizing the civil rights movement, right?
Yes.
And in being on the ground and knowing and the everyday knowledge of people. And so I was just wondering because sometimes people feel like, you know what, I'm not even going to address that. I'm just going to tell these stories. So I just was wondering if you decided to address that and why and how.
That's really the heart and soul of the book. But it's done in a way that when the women were talking about the issue, there are only a couple who really were very pointed talking about sexism. Merle Everest was one. You know, when she ran to be president or the chairman of the NAACP, they said, oh, you're just Medgar's widow. She's not just anything. So she addressed that. Gay McDougall talked about when you hear about the anti-apartheid demonstrations and the strategy, her name is rarely mentioned. That's true. Or it was true. Now, I'm really excited because this book was selected as one of the books for New York's Metropolitan Transit has a Subway Reads campaign, and so this book was selected as one of the books that is featured on the Subway Reads. So 20% of New York City subways for about 6 weeks has little ads about the book, and you can download the chapter on Gay McDougall. And people are doing that and having a lot of fun with it. So yes, but it's interesting that some of the other women, I tried to push that issue a little bit with them, and I realized that was more of my issue and not theirs. And so I backed away from it. I asked Dr. Christmas at one point. She was my pilot interview, so I had more time with her. She was my pilot interview for my dissertation and the first person I talked about. And I said to her, now her late husband, Walter Christmas, was a journalist and an activist as well. And I said to Dr. Christmas, one point, I was feeling my oats, and I said, Dr. Christmas, because I was thinking about all the great black women, single women, who were involved in civil rights and women's rights and things like that. And I said, do you think you would have accomplished more, or would your life, how your life would have been different had you not married? And she did this. She physically recoiled. And she said, my life would have been different and not better. I said, yes, ma'am. I changed. I went on to another point. And the other thing, too, that you have an ethical ambition, Derrick's chapter on evolving relationships. And that if you look at even Kathleen Cleaver in all of the public appearances and what have you. Now she and her husband, Eldridge, eventually divorced, but she never says anything negative about it. Because they're focusing on the larger, mostly on the larger issue. The larger issue of how do you fight a white supremacist system. And even though you have acknowledgement about the sexism and the homophobia and all sorts of stuff, they're all totally involved in this stuff. That's not what they really wanted to focus on. And maybe that's a different book maybe that's a follow-up book or something. And not necessarily with these women, but they just, so I tiptoed around it. I tried to introduce it to a couple other women, and at one point I said, it's not my story. I'm the conduit, and I just need to have the good sense to get out of the way.
All right, well, on that, please. This has been such a terrific evening. We don't want it to end. So I hear there are books upstairs as well as the reception. Please join us upstairs, and we can once again thank Janet.